I was given a week's worth of vacation. Well, that is how I saw it anyways. They called it an out-of-school suspension like it was supposed to be some kind of punishment, but from where I was sitting, which was within the very comfort of my bedroom, it seemed like a vacation. The only problem was that I was the only one at Keller Middle School currently at home. Unfortunately, Dylan still had to go to school, which meant I was stuck here, in a room that doesn't have much of anything more than articles of worn clothing that remained hanging from various inanimate objects throughout my room. In other words, boring. If it was up to me, I probably would have been downstairs cooking brain cells in front of the television screen, but my sister and her false sense of parenthood thought it'd be better to confine me to my room for the duration of my suspension. It was a declaration that would easily be forgotten at the day's end. It turned out self-defense was not a viable pledge of innocence in middle school. In fact, after being violently attacked by two students of considerably larger size, I was lectured on how I went about making the wrong decisions in resolving the matter. According to the principal of the middle school, I should have first respectfully asked the two mongrels, who weren't very fond of words, what problem they were having and how I could have better helped resolve that matter. Now, if things were to escalate from there, which they certainly did, I was to seek out a guidance counselor, which would have served to mediate our problems in formal diplomacy. Then we would have been permitted in neutrality to talk openly about our disagreement. That was all assuming that the two students reputable for physical abuse was completely cool with talking it out. I felt as though this probably wouldn't have been an effective strategy, but who am I to say? I'm just a strangely omniscient middle schooler. Now I was stuck at home, forced to think about my actions, which I had to admit was just as cool as it was the first time I played it in my head. I mean, I wasn't particularly proud of the fact that I took down two kids about twice my size, both in a single hit. Okay, maybe I was. It was all intriguing to say the least. I never desired physical conflict, nor did I ever imagine I could execute it. Like so many of the things that happened throughout my life, I didn't really question any of it. The anticipated sound of a car pulling into the driveway had broken my train of thought. Dad was home for lunch. I ran out of my room. My sister was at school, so I wasn't particularly worried about her catching me disobeying her rules, though her unpredictable schedule would commonly make her suddenly arrive at the most inopportune times. I waited at the door for my father eagerly. It felt as though I was deprived of human contact for days. I never thought that staying home would have been so boring. The door opened. "Hey, Dad," I said. "Oh, what are you doing home?" he asked, with a shocked look upon his face as though he forgot he had a son. "I got into a fight at school." "Oh," he remarked, before turning his way into the refrigerator. "Did you win?" "Well, yeah," I told him with pride, though I knew he wouldn't care for the specifics. "Good," he added, with the resounding crack of a beer can opening. "Aren't you going back to work?" I asked, remarking on the fact that he was already starting to drink. "You're right," he said, and grabbed a second can before heading off to his studio room for the remainder of his break. Yep, that was Dad. Good man, or so I was told by his drinking buds, who were mistaking me for an exhibit at a petting zoo, as all I ever got were pats on the top of my head. He went back off to work shortly after he crushed a can in his hand and discarded it on the living room floor. I took a fond admiration for his style of organization. After all, I modeled my room after that same kind of thinking, and haven't yet seen the floor since we first moved in. Sure, the behavior would have been seen as abnormal for most normal people, but it was what I grew up around. My father was an abstract parent, to say the least. He bought us things, paid the bills, gave us a house. Wasn't much more to ask for. I never really got to do anything with him, but that was fine with me. My sister would usually ask him for things, and unwilling to put up a fight, my father would give in. I could feel his dread over such requests, and I refrained as much as I could from asking anything from him. I just wanted him to remain at rest, as it was too difficult for me to understand the strange hardship he seemed to place himself in. Sometime during my life, Kristen had thought it best to take over as designated parent, and began bossing me around, making up rules as she pleased, and even worse, set the bedtime curfew. There wasn't much I could do, as when it came down to the two of us complaining to Dad, he'd always give in to my sister, only because I let her win. I'm sure I could have changed all that on a whim, but I didn't want to. I just didn't feel like forcing my father to play the hand he so dearly feared. Kristen came home shortly after my father had left, which was good. because I was actually seconds off from opening the reading book that I was supposed to read for school. I wouldn't want to get ahead in schoolwork, now would I? I ran from the kitchen counter up the stairs and dashed directly into my room, closing the door behind me with a stealthy ease that allowed not a single noise to escape. I didn't want her to know I ever left the room. After all, I was allegedly in trouble. She rummaged around downstairs for a bit, and my gnawing boredom kept my ear pressed against the bedroom door as I tried to figure out what she was doing. She usually got home before me, so I was a little curious as to how she spent the few minutes at home before I got off the bus. I had other ways of finding these things out, of course, but lately, with the way things had been turning out, I did not want to risk falling asleep and not returning. Kristen was coming up the stairs, and I pulled my head off the door and leapt right into my bed, cringing as the noisy springs from the mattress may have betrayed my sudden movement. Not that she'd care that much. After all, I was in my room. She knocked on my door. "Derek, are you in there?" she asked. "Yes," I said, acting as though I never even knew she was home. She opened the door and peeked inside. She was looking around my room as though still surprised that it remained a mess, as if I would have cleaned the place up during my time of solitude. "Have you been in here all day?" she asked. Well, you what?" "Well, I had to use the bathroom once." "Oh, Derek, that's fine," she said. A small hint of sympathy was in her voice. She walked right into my room and proceeded to sit down on the corner of my bed, and I was hoping she didn't try to extort a confession out of me. Feeling guilty, I curled my feet up to me, keeping them away from her as though touch would betray my thoughts. She let the silence go on for quite a bit, and the suspense was nearly killing me. What was she up to? "You can come out of your room for a bit, if you want. I'm going to be down by the pool," she said, before getting up to leave the room. It was almost as if that was difficult for her to say, and she had to sum up the courage to do so. "Sweet," was about all I could think. And I leapt out of bed and threw on a bathing suit before swinging out of my room and swiftly sliding down the stair rail to the bottom floor. I nearly skated on the beer cans that tiled the flooring of the next room, and turned my body sideways to squeeze through the narrow opening of the sliding glass door. There it was, the reflective oasis of liberation, the encompassing body of water that was able to eviscerate the harsh and terrible heat of the weather that plagued my life, and I was going to make love to it. And I don't mean in the adult kind of way, not that I know anything about that. I ran to the siding of the pool and looked into the reflective surface of the undisturbed water. There I was, Derek. A handsome guy, if I say so myself, though my hair could have used a bit of grooming. I never truly looked into my own reflection, as I didn't really faze myself, but every time I had, the eyes I looked into felt as though they weren't entirely my own, as though they were a looking-glass window, and I shared the view with another. Perhaps it was my eye color that made me feel that way, considering one was blue and the other green. The difference between the two did make my reflection seem a little skewed, but I already knew that looks meant nothing. It was the feeling that accompanied them that told me what I saw was not entirely restricted to my eyes only. Dancing in my thoughts never lasts long, and certainly doesn't alleviate me from the sun's heat. I needed to swim. The blinding reflections of the sun shimmered with every movement of the water, and the beautiful view of the sky on the water's surface was not going to remain still for long. That I promised. I leapt into the air with all my might and crashed into that perfect, serene setting that was atop the surface of the pool. The cool waters encompassed around my flesh, and carried away with them the heat that forced my body into sweat. The water was nice, and it lacked that terrible chlorine taste that stung any opened and unprotected eyes that dared to look into its watery depths. I couldn't have been any better. After oxygen drew short, I broke the surface of the water again and gulped down air like it was my one and only chance to breathe. My head was just above the water, giving me a great sight on the horizon of the pool. We had a big pool, and at that elevation, it looked even bigger. It was like the Atlantic Ocean was spread before me, and the ripples in the water from my cannonball were giant oceanic waves. I was convinced for the time being that I was a giant sea creature, and I threw my arms out in large-breasted strokes as I covered as much of the ocean as I could. This was my sea, and no boat got through here without me knowing about it. Who was the guy they were talking about at school? Yes, Poseidon, that was me. God of the sea. It was too bad Zeus was standing right there on the edge of the pool, jealous of my leisure. His great shadow loomed over and spoke of the cursed doom to come. I could sense it in the wind, taste the stale envy, and worst of all, see the hatred escaping in waves of heat from his shadowed illusion. I saw his physical reflection on the water surface, and I went to turn a sharp 180 degrees to face him before a body splashed right next to me and dragged me under the water with it. It took me all but 1 second to realize that I was drowning. I wasn't ready at all for the ambush, and I gulped in a large sum of water as I went under. I flailed and kicked off the bottom of the pool, but the hands kept grabbing onto my limbs and held me in place. Terrifying fear gripped me, and I went to bite the fingers that held me as I demanded release. I couldn't hold on for much longer. With one final kick, I jolted up and broke surface, gasping for air as I desperately stroked to get to the side of the pool. I could barely see ahead of me, as I felt for the plastic edging of the pool, and rested my arms on top of it, coughing wildly. I wanted to get out of the water, and to distance myself from the predator, but I didn't have the strength to do so. I could hear someone yelling. Vaguely, I could see Kristen standing before me, shouting at someone in the pool. "David, don't you ever do that again," she shouted. Red hot and furious, she was mad, and there was no doubt about it. There were only but a few times in my life when I managed to get her that angry, and I was still lucky to be able to walk after those days. She was pissed, and it was the first time I was happy to see it. It still felt like I was dying. Sharp pains were flaring from my lungs, and I was grateful that I was above the water, and for that matter, hanging onto the edge of the pool. Kristen knelt down and looked into my face, and I could only make out a fuzzy outline of her image at first, but with each violent cough I could see a little clearer. "You nearly killed him, David!" I couldn't see what I looked like, naturally, but judging by the sight of my sister's face, I looked as bad as I felt. Crawling out of the pool was not easy, but I was not about to stay in there any longer, not with that jerk. Kristen began to help me out after realizing my efforts to escape, and I sat down in relief on the concrete walkway. "Come on. I was just playing with him," shouted David. He was a new one to me. David had a young face carved in egotism, with dirty blonde hair and a muscular build that suffered early stages of atrophy from the likelihood of high school partying. It was my first assumption that he was one of Kristen's new boyfriends, and it seemed as though he wasn't all that much different from the last. I could feel his false sense of pride as he looked at my sister with a boastful grin. I highly doubted my sister found his pathetic attempt to show off impressive. Kristen walked over to a stairway that led into the shallow end of the pool and waited for David to reach her. Her fist was clenched and a firm finger pointed at the ground in front of her toes. She instructed him to come over. I was angry as hell and watched in anticipation. If I did anything like that to him, assuming I could have, I knew for a fact that Kristen would have kicked my butt until I apologized several hundred times, and I could only hope that was what she planned for David. He weaved his way through the shallow end of the pool, floating on his chest like a snake would enclose in on its prey, through a thick prairie of grass. When he got close enough, he lowered his feet into the shallow end, and picked himself up to full height before walking over to Kristen, with that same smug look on his face. I already had a terrible prejudice for any male that was associated with my sister, and he was only fortifying that stereotype. "You're a dick. A real friggin' dick," Kristen said to his face, as he closed in on her. "I know," David replied, before walking up the shallow end stairs and continued to walk right into my sister. The two began holding one another like distant couples reunited, and started making out without refrain, right in front of me, as though I was really looking forward to that. My sister seemed to have instantaneously forgotten about everything that had just happened. I couldn't figure it out. How did she hold on to all the bad things I did for so many years and yet just simply forgets what David had done only seconds ago? At that instant, I hated them both. All I could feel was betrayal as she drove her tongue deeper into his mouth. I was disgusted, both at the scene before me and over the idea that she'd allow him to get away with such a thing, when I was convinced that I'd nearly died a moment ago. I got up and headed for the back door to the house. I had to leave this place. Kristen caught on to where I was going and showed her great concern. Note my sarcasm. "Derek, don't go in there with wet clothes on," Kristen threatened, still half preoccupied with slobbering over her boyfriend's face. I went in anyways. I heard her boyfriend whisper something along the lines of, "Forget him," but I was sure he used a much more derogative term. Once inside, I sat down on the couch and wedged my hand under my shoulder pits. I couldn't help but shape a gesture of disappointment and anger. It was clear that my day was ruined. The one moment of my day that was to be fun, a time of joy, was destroyed by those two. I started saying things out loud. I can't wait till she moves out, and all the other impulsive things siblings probably say about each other 1,000 times over. But I knew it wasn't her that I was angry at. It was him. David. Or whatever his pathetic name was. As long as he was there, she wouldn't care. I went to my room where I should have stayed in the first place. That night didn't get any better. Kristen had an entire class of friends over, and the whole house was cram-packed full of equivalent buttholes like David. Only a few times did I dare venture out of my room to either gather food or use the bathroom, but every time I did, I was stopped by every single high schooler who would ask me the same thing, which would either be, where was the booze, or where can I score some babes? I offered what wisdom I could, but it usually involved leaving the front door to my house and driving miles away. After a while, it began to die down, and I was getting very bored inside my room. I wanted to, at least, make sure that enough of my house remained to wake up to in the morning. And more so, I wanted to see if it'd be trashed enough that my father would be aware that it wasn't the result of his own doings. That would then spawn one entertaining verbal argument between him and my sister. Since I was pretty mad at her, I was looking forward to such a fruitless dispute where I could take sides with my father and really get under her skin. I creaked open my door as I had in the past, usually when either sneaking out late at night or when I'm not supposed to leave the room. I did it just enough so I could see out, but nobody could see in. This was great for avoiding unwanted attention, and also to see if it was safe enough to tread through my house unnoticed. When I saw the coast was clear, I jumped out of my room and walked slowly down the stairs, with my hand gripped onto the side rail. It was dark and creepy in my house, as all the televisions were left on channels we didn't get, leaving the eerie white noise static on the screen. Bodies were on the ground, usually with drinks still in hand, and I hardly knew if any of them were still alive. I felt as though a zombie would pounce up and take a hold of my leg at any moment. I heard a group of guys in the living room, but walked on relentlessly as I wanted to reach the kitchen. My head looked forward as a means to avoid any eye contact for that matter, potentially nonsensical conversations. I was nearly there, but, of course, he had to intervene. "Derek, my man, come over here!" The words were slurred from a drunken tongue. My shoulders tightened up and a shiver shook through my limbs as I recognized the voice clearly, even though I had only heard him for the first time earlier that day. I should have kept going, but I assumed it would have somehow offended him and matters would have gotten worse. I wasn't down for running from a drunk man. 4 guys were on my living room sofa and had made their generous contribution of beer cans onto the floor. I walked in slowly, and they all looked at me in blatant confusion like the alcohol in their veins were causing hallucinogenic effects. Who the heck is this?" one asked. "He's my bro, man. That's who he is," David said, nudging his pal as though I was some respected individual of the clique. "Come here, bro, we gotta talk." I knew this was bad, but I moved in closer anyways. The place reeked like my father on a weekend morning, and I tried not to breathe the toxic air. I didn't want to end up turning into any of these guys, or worse, one of the corpses on the floor. David grabbed onto the arm of my shirt and pulled me onto the sofa, forcing me to sit next to him as he threw his slack arm around my back and breathed a terrible odor into my face. "This is my man, I'm telling you now," he spoke, as poetically as a drunk man could to the 3 other guys seated around him and I. He waved his head around into the faces of his friends like a long story was soon to unfold. "Derek here is gonna get me real good with his sister, ain't that right, buddy?" No, actually no, that isn't right at all. In fact, I'm going to try everything within my ability to make sure she hates your guts enough that she will never, ever decide to date a man ever again. And had I the power, I would have her castrate you in the most humiliating way, that you may never prosper your terrible offspring across this planet. Instead of speaking my thoughts aloud, I just remained quiet. The other guys began laughing in delay as though they caught onto a joke a little too late. You think that's gonna work? I thought you said you were just gonna get her drunk enough that she'd do anything," spoke another klutz, who showed the same brain damage as anyone who had too much exposure to David's dumbassery. "That won't be enough. She's too tight, brah. Stuck-up whore. Hear me out. I will get there. Right in between the legs, just give me time. If I got a good old Georgie E, will do the trick." David snickered as he pulled a pill capsule out of his back pocket and waved it in front of the audience. Out like a light. The rest of the guys laughed as they exchanged different hand gestures with another, encouraging each other's ruthless behaviors. I didn't want to touch any of them and sat as tight as I could without looking anyone in the eye. I remained invisible. I sat there for what felt like hours as the four drunks continued to talk about my sister, past girlfriends, female classmates, and even their teachers in a sexual manner. It was terrible and disgusting, no matter how little I understood. It did take a bright mind to know that whatever they were talking about wasn't good. I wanted nothing to do with it, and every mentioning of my sister made me want to further kill these guys. The exposure itself to such drunken, low-life individuals was adding up. I felt dizzy, disoriented, and strange emotions collided with my conscience that I had never previously registered before. I tried to shut off my mind. I didn't dare wonder what possibly went on behind the heads of these individuals. David and his pal to my left were bouncing up and down on the sofa in excitement, and I tried to place my hands on the sofa to balance. I feared bumping into either of them. I couldn't take it much longer, and though I sat right in the midst of them, none of them seemed to recognize I was even there. And so I took a bold action and, well, stood up. "Where you going, bro?" David asked. I didn't say a word. I just stood there nervously hoping his delirious mindset would cause him to forget what he was asking. "You grabbing more drinks for us, little man?" "Oh, good idea." David threw a celebratory hand into the air that nearly caused him to fall off the sofa in his wobbly state. The others began cheering as I wedged myself out of the group as carefully as possible, as any physical contact would result in them falling over en masse. Yeah, more drinks. That is exactly what they needed. I decided I'd better just head off to my room while I still had a chance. As I reached the stairs and placed my hand onto the rail, I froze in place. Looking back at the four guys, a terrible shiver waked throughout my body. All the things they said about my sister and her other girlfriends were replayed in my head simultaneously like a giant audio collage. The more I thought about it, the faster the room would spin, and I was forced to confine myself to my own thoughts. Though I refused to listen to the ambient voices, I could still tell something was very wrong, and it stunk far worse than the living room floor. I climbed the stairs slowly and looked at the door to my sister's room as it came into sight. She and her friends were inside, gossiping about things no guys could ever understand, and they all did it at once, speaking over one another in a jumbled mess. I felt fear for them. I didn't know what it was that made me feel like that, but it was very strong. Even though my sister had practically disowned me earlier in that very day. Even though she nearly let me die by the hands of her psychotic boyfriend, and even though she nearly let me drown by a lunatic, and rewarded him with a kiss. I could just not leave her like that. That night I sat outside her bedroom door until morning, making sure nobody got near her.